Hey everyone, it's Mr. Lance coming to you again through the power of the internet. And today we're going to talk about the 5 parts to a National History Day product. And these 5 parts apply to the English 1 paper that you write as well. So let's get right into it. Part 1 is your background. I like to compare these 5 parts to kind of like a plot. So the background would be the exposition. This is where you establish the time, the place, and the topic that you're researching. You really want to provide some context here. And by the end of your background, you're going to establish your thesis statement. This is your argument that the rest of your product is going to be proving. And you're also going to provide a brief preview of the entire topic. Typically, the background isn't more than a couple paragraphs when you're typing a paper. So, for example, if we look at last year's theme, which was breaking barriers in history, and I'm going to use the topic of the Santee Cooper Electric Company and the Santee Cooper project. So, what I need to do first in my background is establish the main problem for the paper. So, the problem for this topic would have been the Great Depression and the lack of electricity and how they created a barrier for rural South Carolina. Then I would go through and reveal the solution for my paper. This is essentially my argument. I would argue that the Santee Cooper project, along with the Rural Electrification Administration, which was part of a federal government funded program, helped South Carolina recover from the Great Depression, not only because it created jobs, but it also provided electricity to many of the rural areas, kind of brought the state back into the 20th century. So, the second part of the 5 steps of an NHD project would be the build-up. So, if we're comparing it to a plot again, this would be like the rising action. You're going to go over the events and conflicts that lead directly into your topic. So, yeah, again, this is more context, but you're going to go into a lot more detail than you did in your background. Here, you want to identify your key players or parties and groups that are involved in the topic, and you also want to establish your causes or your needs. So, for this year, because of communication, what not only is the message that's being communicated, but why does communication need to exist in the first place if we look at the context of your topic? So let's look at the example again with Santee Cooper and how it fits with build up. So build up, I would just look at the history of Santee Cooper. If I did some research, I would learn about the Santee Canal that was talked about by George Washington even in America's early years. Then I would also talk about the state of South Carolina's industry before the Great Depression, and maybe I would compare it to other parts of the United States to kind of show how far behind South Carolina really was. And then I really would want to get into my problem, right? So that's Black Tuesday. That's the Great Depression when it starts. And how did my problem affect people? Specifically, how did it affect the parties that I had kind of already established in my background and my buildup? I'd introduce key players like FDR and his idea behind the New Deal. And then I would focus even more in on my topic, and I'd talk about James F. Burns and the Santee Cooper Project. And that's where I'd kind of introduce the solution. And this would lead me right into the heart of the story, which is the next part. The heart is kind of like the climax of the plot. This is your turning point. This is your main event. It's very important. You want to talk this year about what's being communicated. What is the message? Why is it being communicated? Who's the audience? Who's supposed to hear this message? And you want to relate to the theme a lot here. Okay, this is the heart of your story. This is what makes it beat. You don't have a heart. If you don't have the heart to your story, it might as well be dead, right? Let's go ahead and look at an example of how it was used last year with Santee Cooper again. So this one was actually pretty simple. I would talk about the building of the Santee Cooper project, any cooperation that happened with the New Deal programs. Did the project run into any problems? So, for example, a lot of New Deal programs were argued against because of how much power um, essentially the federal government had, and was it a constitutional thing? Did the Constitution allow for the federal government to do these kinds of programs? And if the St. Cooper project did run into problems, what kind of solutions were made in order to continue the project and keep moving forward? So I would really go into detail and tell the story here. And that would take me into my short term effects. This is like the following action of a plot. You want to look at the immediate impacts of your heart. So for this year, it would be of the communication. Okay. Did the communication lead to an understanding? This is where I think we can really tie in the second part of this year's theme. If it didn't lead to understanding, was there misunderstanding? Was there misinformation? If so, what was the impact of those things? If the communication worked, how did it affect the parties that were involved? If it didn't work, how did it affect the parties? Okay. And you just really want to look at the immediate effects of your event. Okay. Very close to when your event happened. I'm talking 5 to 15, maybe even 20 years, but you don't really want to go beyond that. We really kind of want to focus on what happened immediately after. So let's look at Santee Cooper, for example, and its short term impacts. After Santee Cooper was built, how did it affect the Great Depression, specifically in South Carolina? Did it help break the economic barriers that South Carolina was facing at the time? What about the parties that were involved? Think about the rural areas that were without electricity. How did their lives change because electricity was brought to them? Did other states mimic what South Carolina was doing with the Santee Cooper project? Surely South Carolina wasn't the only one that hadn't brought electricity all across their state. So we can start looking at like a national impact on this. And then I would go into my long term impacts. This is the resolution. This is where we get that in history part of the theme. So we really want to drive home the historical significance. We're talking about lasting impacts 20, 30, even more years. If you can get it to today, go ahead and do that. Try to connect it to today as close as you can. You want to talk about how your topic created lasting change. Why would the world be different if your topic had never happened? And this is again where you can connect your topic to local, state, national, or international history. Don't force it if it doesn't fit one of those, but take your topic and your argument as far as you can. So again, let's look at Santee Cooper one last time. So, Santee Cooper, how has it impacted South Carolina today? What are its lasting impacts? Did you know that Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion were created because of Santee Cooper? Did you know that Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion attract a lot of tourists for camping and fishing and whatnot? What about power today? How does Santee Cooper continue to provide power to South Carolina? Does it provide power to residential areas and commercial areas, or is it just one or the other? How has Santee Cooper impacted specific communities today? And since we're in the 21st century, what about energy conservation? Does Santee Cooper help South Carolina with that? Or has it stayed kind of static since it was established in the 1940s? And these are all things to consider, good questions, good things to research. So just remember your 5 parts of the NHD project. and be sure to address them all. And they are background, build up, heart, short term, and long term. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Feel free to ask me, Mr. Burrell, Miss McKeever, or Miss Bell if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next one.